I'm pleased to be joined by John Courtneidge, a Quaker and a former Labour candidate for Parliament in 2015. I've asked John to join us on Not the Andrew Marr Show because we had the vote yesterday for a ceasefire in Gaza, and two MPs who are Quakers did not vote for ceasefire. They preferred an amendment that was drawn up by Keir Starmer. Now, I have a background in the Quakers in that my mum was born a Quaker and my dad became a Quaker. And I was brought up to believe in pacifism, and the Quakers, in my mind, represent peace and for standing up for peace in all cases. I was surprised that these two MPs, Ruth Cadbury and Katherine West, did not vote for ceasefire, which to me is a clear call for peace. So I wanted to find out more about why they might not have, were they going against what the Quakers are saying, and also the background to the Quakers for anyone who's not familiar with them. And John, thank you for agreeing to tackle this subject. Good to see you. How are you doing?
I'm extremely honoured to be involved in this interview and be allowed to speak, Crispin. I describe this event as possibly the moment, because I think we're actually at a transformative moment in time.
Well, look, I'm going to start by going into the background a bit of the vote itself and what the Quakers are saying and what the two MPs are saying. So I'm just going to show a screenshot of the Quaker statement. Quaker organisations call for a ceasefire and humanitarian protections in Gaza. Further military action will not bring peace. We know this as Quakers who are committed to peace and as students of history. That is why we are calling for an immediate ceasefire and humanitarian access and action to address the underlying injustice of occupation and inequalities underlying this situation in the long term. Pretty clear that we need to be moral about this. We need to stand up and speak for peace, and the war crimes must stop. They're calling out the war crimes. There's no doubt about that in that statement. And generally just calling for a ceasefire. There's no ambiguity in that statement either. It's quite clear the Quakers are going along with this idea of peace. Would you agree with that, John?
Entirely, and that's really then at the root of the circumstance in which Ruth Cadbury and Katherine West find themselves.
We're going to start with Ruth Cadbury. This is just to show that Ruth Cadbury is quite clearly not keeping her Quakerism quiet. It's not something she doesn't want to influence her politics. She's put this in her third paragraph of her talking about herself on her website. I was raised as and have always been a Quaker. So she's making that into almost a selling point that she's a Quaker, yes. which is something you would think, if you're going to be saying you're a Quaker, then act like a Quaker. So this is what she said. This has come out after the vote, because I was looking for this before the vote. Nothing was there. This is what's come out after the vote. I share the overwhelming concern of constituents who have written to me in the last week that the violence must stop. Most have asked for me to call for a ceasefire. However, the challenges of achieving a formal ceasefire are significant, and I believe we have a duty to find a credible and sustainable approach. Both parties to the conflict have to agree to and stick to a ceasefire, which both Israel or Hamas have made clear they are not prepared to do. I worry that a ceasefire at this moment in time without the release of hostages by Hamas risks freezing the conflict in its current state, which would be disastrous for both Israelis and Palestinian civilians. Hamas cannot be allowed to control Gaza, nor can there be a reoccupation of Gaza by Israel. I therefore support Labour's calls for the immediate end of hostilities right now, and for long enough to get adequate humanitarian aid in, and in order to start the work towards a lasting and sustainable peace. So what she's saying there is, oh, it's okay to call for a ceasefire, but they won't do it. So why should we do it? Is that what's your take on that? I mean, that just sounds like she's just being she's just not going to speak up and be moral. I mean, she's also not mentioned the fact that she's a Quaker. She's talked about the fact that her constituents have spoken to her, different faith groups, but her Quakerism has been eradicated in that statement. There's nothing of it. I'm just going to go to Katherine West. Katherine West says, as I've always said, as Labour's motion sets out, ultimately, the only road to peace in the region is a two-state solution with a Palestinian state alongside a safe and secure Israel. For too long, the international community has failed to grasp this challenge, putting it on the too difficult pile. We cannot afford this to continue. However hard this will be, making real progress with this goal will be a priority for the next Labour government. I've received hundreds of emails over the past few days, and I share the overwhelming wish of my constituents to see the violence stop. There are significant challenges to achieving a formal ceasefire. It requires both parties to agree and to stick to it, and the statements from Israel and from Hamas do not suggest this is likely. Hamas have spoken of their intention to carry out further attacks like 7 October again and again. There's also a real risk that it would freeze the conflict in its current state, which would be disastrous for Israelis and Palestinians alike. Same flannel, really, isn't it? Two-state solution, and similarly, this idea that we can't have a ceasefire because Israel and Hamas won't agree to it. They've copied the same idea there, and also this stuff about I've heard loads of people who want peace, and I want that too, but I don't know if it's really, if it's ready yet. Having read the two statements from the two Quakers in the House of Parliament, what's your take on the flannel? I mean, is that just flannel?
Well, they're both clearly Zionists, and the strong evidence in Katherine West's statement are the two adjectives, where she speaks of a Palestine and a safe and secure Israel. Not a safe and secure Palestine and a safe and secure Israel, but she specifically points those adjectives towards the fruits of war. If I'm generous to this, I would say that these people haven't thought things through clearly enough. And if I'm being more honest, Quakers in Britain and worldwide are in a state of what I can call institutional hypocrisy. Now, hypocrisy is believing one thing and doing the exact opposite. And you cannot have peaceful capitalism. It's not possible. It's the same point as I've made to our friend Molly Scott Cato. You cannot have green capitalism. Capitalism, by its very nature, because of that effect, is rapacious. It knows no boundaries whatsoever. And in the end, if there isn't a truth and reconciliation and the re-establishment of a single state Palestinian solution, then where we are here in 2023 will get worse, because that's the laws of thermodynamics. Remember, my PhD is in chemistry.
Right.
It will get worse unless we are active to make it better. And I've said for years and years and years, the world is waiting for Quakers to get off the fence and say that a new economic system, which I term cooperative socialism, needs to replace capitalism, not try to manage it, not sit in leafy suburbs and use typewriters writing letters to MPs, which is what one of the Conservative MPs used to give as a definition of Quakers: people who live in leafy suburban homes with too much time and too many typewriters. So it's time, and I speak to all of my fellow Quakers, to have the courage that Jesus showed and to put up their hands and their lives and their voices for a world of peace.
Mm. Now, look, obviously, as a Quaker with some Quaker background, I'm interested in the history of the pacifism, especially.
Yeah.
Would you be able to explain where that comes from and how it has manifested itself in history, this pacifism from Quakers?
I can do it in a couple of quick jumps. In the 17th century, there were a series of wars, the so-called English Civil Wars, and the parliamentary side set up a thing called the New Model Army. There were lots of Quakers who were involved in that, fighting what they called the Lamb's War, Lamb as in Christ. At the end of those wars, the monarchy was re-established or reimposed, Charles II, and the early Quakers then declared in a declaration that they were in favour of peace. And that was all to do really with trying to distance themselves from the idea of civil war. Then in the First World War, there were a number of young Quakers who said that the absolute pacifist position, the absolutist position, was conscientious objection. And they refused not only to be conscripted into the army and other military organizations, but they also refused what was then termed alternative service. And they went to prison and they were horribly treated. There were other people in prison with them, socialists, and I think also Jehovah's Witnesses, although my grasp on this is a little bit hazy. I can point to some books, we could do some research. Then in the 1960s, at the height of the completely fake Cold War, there was an influx of pacifists into Quakerism. And I think that's partly because if you choose to not speak about, and I'm going to use the G word, God, then you're cutting yourself off from a conversation that's been going on in human history ever since humans have been around, whether you use the word God or the divine or the light within or whatever it might be. Now, most of those newcomers, I think in the 1960s, were democratic socialists. The rise of the Wilson government, 64, 66, the fact that Harold Wilson didn't send British forces to Vietnam. It's meant that the Quaker Socialist Society annual lecture, the Salter lecture, and you can find the Quaker Socialist Society details on the internet. At Britain Yearly Meeting, which is the yearly meeting of Quakers in Britain, the largest gathering of people seems to be for the Salter lecture, named after Alfred and Ada Salter and their daughter Beryl. Bermondsey story, there's books and so on. So those of us who have stuck it out, because Quakerism is absolutely the right way to express one's religious life. It's not dogmatic, it's open to the leadings of the Holy Spirit. There, in theory, isn't a hierarchy, but of course there is a huge hierarchy. I could talk about that. And at some point, and this point has come now, we may have thought it might have come with Ukraine, but not really. But this circumstance presently going on in Palestine is the transformative moment. I'm quite sure of that. So, as one of the historic peace churches, Quakers have been involved in the world, in this world, but not of this world. Of the other historic peace churches, the Anabaptists, particularly now in the United States, the Hutterites, who withdraw completely from the world, the Amish, who live in the world but not of the world, the Mennonites and the Brethren. I'm sure that these peace churches are looking to Quakers worldwide to stop shilly-shallying and call it as it is. and call it as it is. If Jesus could be that brave in Gethsemane, surely we should be just as brave in Littlehampton and wherever else we might be.
And I mean, the other aspect of the Quakers that I was brought up with is honesty,
Yeah.
and not lying. I mean, but the Quaker price was trusted by people because it was an honest price, which is partly why companies like Cadbury's have done quite well because of their Quaker association. I mean, obviously they've been sold off now, but honesty is not really great in politics, is it? I mean, would it not be good to have properly Quaker politicians who are honest and speak out for peace, rather than maybe a couple of so-called Quaker politicians who seem to benefit from the name, but actually are not doing the business?
Yeah, I mean, my friend John Morris down in Guildford has for probably now decades run a thing called the Peace Party. And each election time, I think he puts himself up for election. My experience with all organizations over the last 20 years is that centralized organizations always get co-opted by money. This is as true of the Labour Party, which sent me this morning a request for £17, having previously offered me a hearing about the fake anti-Semitism charge. Can you believe it? They actually sent me a request for money from an organisation that flicked the bird at me, which is a Quaker Canadian expression. I won't demonstrate it on screen. People will know what I'm talking about. And equally, Quakers now are broke, absolutely broke, because those former Quaker capitalist organisations, or shall I call them more generously Quaker business organisations, the Cadburys, the Fry's, the Rowntrees, the Barclays, the Lloyds, Clark Shoes, Cars Biscuits, and so on, have simply gone through the three-generational switch, and they are now owned by nakedly capitalist companies. Rowntrees are owned by Nestle, would you believe? The baby milk scandal. Cadbury's is mixed up with some US-based capitalist outfit. They do their production now not in Bourneville and Birmingham, but in Poland. I think their chocolate's perfectly good. That's the chocolate that I eat. But it proves the point that the slippage, because of that effect, is such that the poorest get poorer and the rich, so-called, become more powerful. As Quakers, we have tried, when I say we, I've owned two businesses, so I tried to have my businesses run on ethical lines, as near I could moral lines as well. But the Cadburys, the Rowntrees, all the rest that I outlined have demonstrated unequivocally that ethical capitalism, or moral capitalism, which is a complete misnomer, cannot work. It may operate, but it can't work. And in the case of the Cadburys, three generations, if you read their biographies, gradually they became more and more distant from their workforces, and in the end the business was sold.